This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone. At this noon hour, I want to welcome New York Times editor Doug Schorzman to our lunch and learn, as we like to call it here. Jesse Mayshark will be interviewing Doug. Jesse is the co-founder of Compass, the best source for local, political, business, economic, everything news. Doug guides the international coverage of events, including the war in Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic, and assorted disruptions, political and economic, across the world. Needless to say, Doug is very busy right now. So I want to thank him for being here, because I know you are very busy and we appreciate you being here. I am Maria Cornelius, president of the local chapter of the East Tennessee Society of Professional Journalists. So I want to welcome you on behalf of our chapter. And with that said, I am going to mute myself and Jesse, let you take this over.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Maria. And yeah, Doug, thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Sure.
We just thought that it would be, of course, we're all very focused on sort of like local and national news right now because of the upcoming elections and everything. But there's a much bigger world out there, and that's your beat. So I thought it would be just kind of interesting to hear about. Can we start off just by introducing you a little bit? You're a deputy international editor for the New York Times, and you've been there for a couple of decades, but just kind of talk us through how do you go from being a paper boy to helping lead global coverage for the biggest paper in the country?
That's probably a distinct lack of imagination, Jesse. I don't know. I've never wanted to do anything else. I knew from a pretty young age that I was interested in writing and in telling stories. And I did. I started with a paper out. That was just an early way to make money, but I was pretty fascinated. You know, my parents both rallied around their morning paper every day, and that was part of the family tradition. And I got a great opportunity when I was a young teenager. I went to Washington State University college kind of camp where you got to choose kind of from various things. You could choose computer science, business, all sorts of different class structures. And I saw they had print journalism in the morning and broadcast journalism in the afternoon, and that sounded perfect. So I did that and loved it. Just came away from that summer totally jazzed, and won a scholarship back the next summer. And my local county weekly, the Ritzville Adams County Journal in Eastern Washington State, wanted to interview me, and they did a little story about me getting a scholarship to go back. And the editor, who I realize now with hindsight was himself an incredibly young and overworked journalist at the time, was, hey, you ever consider writing sports from your town? I could sure use some help. I gotta travel a lot of places. And I was like, at 15, I was, yeah, sure. So I started writing sports, and then started covering local city council, and then started doing photography and my own kind of general assignment stuff. And I was hooked. That was it. I mean, college was an excuse to work at the university newspaper, which for me was the Oregon State University Barometer. And it was just steeping myself in it. And the editing part of it came about a little by accident. I think, like a lot of people who start, I considered myself a reporter. I still do in a lot of ways. But I graduated in '92, and that was a little blip economically, with a lot of hiring freezes all around the country. I'm sure some of you remember. And I wanted to stay close to where I was. I had a girlfriend who I thought was pretty cool, and she was still in school. And so I took the job that I could. And the first was an editing internship at the Seattle Times, which was great, and really introduced me to the idea of like curating a report for your readers. It's not something that really just hadn't occurred to me then. But at a bigger newspaper like that, it was a real revelation to me. And the first job I took was a page design job, basically, at the Salem Statesman Journal in Salem, Oregon. And then I progressed to front page editor and running the daily news meeting, and just loved that process of, hey, how do you give the world to your readers? What kind of mix do you need? What's important? Just was totally consumed by that idea. And I worked in Austin, Texas for 4 years. And then got a call from the New York Times asking whether I wanted to come there as an editor after a tryout. And that was in 2001. So I started on the Metro desk at the Times in 2001, which was the most boring year ever until it wasn't. and then it was really quite a full employment act for journalists. So I was on Metro through September 11th coverage. And then when the United States started airstrikes on Afghanistan, I moved to the international desk, which had always been an interest. And I was lucky to really, go there at a time when it went from a pretty sleepy little operation to driving the coverage of the entire newspaper. And since then, it really has been war footing for me as an editor for the most part. Most of my career at the Times has been running foreign correspondence, and especially conflict zone correspondence. Not sure how that happened. A lot of us worked together on the Metro desk before the country went to war. But some of it was just accidentally finding an affinity for it and an interest in it. I've been weekend editor on the international desk through some pretty interesting times. I started with the Russian invasion of Georgia, which is feeling eerily similar these days. And, went on to the Arab Spring and the Fukushima nuclear meltdown and tsunami and all sorts of action there. But then started getting the chance to travel to some of the places I covered. I became more of an assigning editor, like a beat reporter, what we call regional editors. And my beat was Afghanistan and Pakistan and Syria and Iraq. And that expanded to include Israel, Palestinian territories after a while. And I got to go to a lot of those places, and that was a real revelation too. It's like there's nothing beats being there and eating the food and meeting the people and hearing their everyday concerns. I got the great opportunity to go out to Hong Kong for 3 years. And this is something I should probably explain. I'll back up a little bit. But on the international desk, we've gone to 24-hour coverage. We actually do not really think about the print newspaper anymore. It is all about digital coverage for us. There's a team of very smart editors that kind of collates the print version of the New York Times every day, almost as a daily magazine. But when it comes to the assigning operation, what we do on the international desk, working with our correspondents, we are worried about getting the news up as soon as possible, as thoroughly as possible, everywhere we're read. And so to that end, we opened very big editing hubs in 2 other places. We've got one in London, which now has more editors than our New York operation does, our New York international desk operation. And we had one in Hong Kong, which covered Asia. It was in Hong Kong until a couple of years ago when the mainland decided they would start messing with our visas and stomp any hint of dissent out in Hong Kong. And now it's in Seoul, South Korea. So a lot of the people who do what I do now do it in a completely different time zone. And we have found that to be a complete success. We're getting a lot more eyes on our stories. We're getting more subscribers because we're taking the news very seriously in the places where it's happening, in the time where it's happening, and just hiring a lot more local people to help us do that coverage, including our most senior correspondents. So we really have become a truly international operation, rather than just sending an Ivy League reporter overseas. We're finding people from all over the place. So it's been fascinating. It constantly changes. And if anything, it's only gotten more intense the last couple of years.
Well, and so I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you go about covering the whole world. And the first thing I want to ask, though, you're talking about, that you're getting more readers and subscribers from that coverage. I feel like a lot of US news operations that used to have substantial international coverage have really cut back on that in the last.
Absolutely. And it's really disheartening. I mean,
so,
a lot of the people that I work with every day came up doing it at different newspapers, like came to the idea of international coverage from a host of papers. I mean, the Boston Globe used to be famous for the quality of its foreign correspondence. I remember at the beginning of the Iraq War, living in fear of like what the LA Times and the Washington Post were going to do. We were all following Anthony Shadid, for the Post, who was doing it better than anybody. But the LA Times too, and that has gone away. And I mean, maybe there's some satisfaction to being, the big brand that's surviving in international journalism, but mostly it's just a sense of sadness. It's harder for people to break into it. And that's with the kind of decline in the economics for good metro level papers everywhere. I see that as a troubling thing, in part because, your selection of talent, just changes, and you have to go to different places to try to find people. But the same opportunity, it means also that the opportunities I had, kind of growing into that role are not what younger journalists have right now. And that's troubling. I think that should be troubling for everybody.
But for the Times, you feel like that's an important part of its brand and identity, the global reach. And I guess, how is that actually functioning on I know you don't work on the business side, but like, is that seen within the paper and the organization as being important, not just to its journalistic mission, but kind of its brand?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So our business side bosses have set goals for subscriptions. As a lot of we live on a paywall. We were one of the first big newspapers to go there. And we decided that with the bottom dropping out of advertising, that is where we're going to be. Basically the idea within the Times is we want to be the HBO of the journalism world. And that is, people go to us for quality. We're never going to have the total audience that, say, Netflix does, or some of the bigger kind of operations. But we want people to come to us for quality. And our subscription growth goals, international is driving that now. The goal for what we want to accomplish in the next 5 years, 2/3 of that growth is foreseen in international readers and subscription. Now, I'm lucky because even though I know that goal is there, I mean, I don't really feel it's like, hey, let's build some subscribers today. Is ever what we come out of the chute saying in a day. It's really, hey, let's cover it. Let's give people what's happening, and let's have the best investigative, the best feature writing, the best kind of report that we can put together every day. But we're all aware of it, and it's been working. We've been ahead of our goals on that, luckily, for the past few years. We have had a tremendous growth in international readership and subscriptions, and a lot of that is because we've just hired more people. We've hired more people to be out there, to be doing the coverage, and really committed to making sure that our readers see their authentic lives and interests in our coverage. What does that mean? Honor news where it happens. Don't pander to people. They don't necessarily want to read a local newsletter, wondering about the quality of the local macro brews or anything. What they want is when news happens, that the Times is going to be there covering it as an important event in that time zone. With a sophisticated take, and maybe one that their own local media won't take on, because maybe they're beholden to political forces or risk that we can, not ignore, but that, don't limit us as much. And it's been working so far anyway. And
talk about your structure a little bit. How many editors do you have? How many reporters do you have around the world? What's the footprint?
I think right now, in the last year or so, I think we're at around 200 reporters around the world. That's split over roughly 30 bureaus. And some of those bureaus are very large, and because their countries are very complex. India would come to mind there, where we have probably 5 full-time reporters. Now, not all of those reporters are, I guess, what you would consider the traditional foreign correspondent. And these are the most senior reporters we have, fully staff members. They generally will stay in a place from 4 to 5 years at a time, and then we will move them on. Okay. But a lot of our reporters are full-time employees. I mean, we hire full-time, we pay benefits, but maybe they stay in their countries where they are because of local knowledge, and expertise. So it's a mix of both kind of what we consider to be correspondents and kind of bureau reporters, but 200 roughly, I think, at last count.
Mhm. Well, and I thought it might be interesting to talk about a couple of specific stories or issues to kind of get a sense of how you operate. And
Mhm.
one obvious one is the COVID pandemic,
Yeah.
because that was an unusual story in that it really was a global story. It affected different places at different times, but it really did. And kind of like all these different countries were wrestling with the same sets of questions about how to deal with it. How did you all, obviously the Times was doing a lot of domestic coverage of that too, but
Yeah.
how did you approach that as an international story?
It was immensely difficult as an international story because suddenly our people couldn't go places. We couldn't just, the life of a foreign correspondent is to like know your local airlines like the back of your hand, and suddenly nobody could go anywhere. It's like sometimes borders were just completely closed, and other times maybe it was 2-3 weeks in quarantine anytime you tried to get anywhere. That was a huge hurdle. Now, we rely a lot on, I guess, what you consider local informants, stringers, contract writers, and we ended up leaning on them much more heavily to help us cover COVID in various places. Like suddenly our Southeast Asia reporters could not get to Vietnam for, let's say, for a month or two. What did that look like? Well, we had to rely a lot more heavily on kind of contract freelancers to help us, which is not normally something we want to do. There was also, particularly in that first year, when those early strains of COVID felt very lethal and we saw healthcare systems breaking, there was a lot of alarm. Like I'll go back to our India team there, where foreigners could not get hospital beds. And so increasingly the decision to send our people out to the public to really cover what was happening became very fraught. And kind of your personal protective gear became a lifeline. You learned it well. The second that that the vaccine was available, in some cases we were flying reporters back to the United States or to Canada to make sure they could be vaccinated before they went back, because it wasn't offered to them right away in the countries they were covering. So logistically, it was incredibly difficult. Another hurdle was how similar it sounded and felt. Like sometimes, hospital systems overwhelmed in Pakistan, hospital systems overwhelmed in London, and so it was a little bit of a challenge to kind of keep things feeling fresh. It was also the beginning of constant live coverage for our international desk. Where now increasingly, if you go to the New York Times homepage or you go to the app on your mobile device, you'll see that we have 4 or even 5 live news coverage events going on at the same time. The COVID briefing was the very first all live, every day, nonstop kind of live event for us in the Times' history. And that was the moment we really started cracking the code. How do you have to staff? When you think about it, what does it take to put up a new news story about one thing every 15 minutes, every half hour? It changes the way you staff your reporters. It changes the way you staff your desk. For a lot of us old timers, it was a return to kind of rewrite culture with a vengeance, where suddenly it was really important to have on the desk people who were very fast, fluid, and able at writing, even if they were nominally editors. You kind of repurpose them to monitoring news reports around the world and redoing them and then making the calls to verify them and seek them out. So it changed the way we approached news coverage fundamentally. COVID did, and we've found that to be a success as well. So now we're in the middle of live briefing the Israeli elections today. That's part of what I'm doing on my day. But we have other things going as well. You know, we're still live coming off the Brazil elections. So a lot changed because of COVID. And what it taught us is that you really only to a certain degree can do more with less. Sometimes you got to do more with more. And we were lucky that our company was willing to make the effort to kind of expand our reporter staff and our editor staff in order to do it.
Well, and then I thought another story that would be interesting to talk about is the ongoing war in Ukraine. You talked about that your focus has been on sort of conflict areas. So I assume you're engaged there.
Yeah.
Just give some sense of how do you cover a war zone? How do you cover something where, you know, the lines are changing every day and where like obviously you talked about physical safety with COVID, but there's a whole other level of that when you're dealing with active combat. So just what is the strategy to cover something like that?
We've pulled a lot of resources to focus on Ukraine. It is one of the single most significant events in recent history. For the first time again, the world is facing the prospect of an expansive war that threatens to bring in other actors. It's a real moment. It is also more hazardous than anything we ever saw in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I was centrally involved in Afghanistan coverage for 20 years. And I'm telling you, we have seen nothing like this. The nature of the war, which is haphazard but constant long distance shelling, it means that you don't always know when you're at risk. And proximity, I mean, sometimes 500 yards is the same as 15 miles. You know, distance from the front is not necessarily a signifier of safety. So what do we do? Anybody we have in the field has been trained in kind of high intensity conflict zone kind of things. You know, what do you do when the bombardment starts? What do you do when a crowd turns panicked and hostile and people make a press to run for doors? There are training, sometimes month-long training things that people go through, and we've put all our people through that. If you're anywhere near the front, you've gone through that. We have a security team that has been growing. Anybody we have out toward the front is traveling with a full-time security guard. These people are unarmed, but they do tend to be veterans of military service, and they are kind of eyes in the back of a reporter's head. When you're trying to focus on an interview or jotting down a scene, you are not able to look around you and see, where is that crowd moving? Where has the area of fire shifted? One person can't do it. And even a reporter and a photographer team can't do it, because the photographers are even more focused on what's immediately in front of them. And so we're constantly traveling with security advisors who are trained in combat first aid. All our people are too. And who are able to really be that kind of take the temperature of the safety of the zone around you. So basically we're moving in groups of 3 through a lot of this area. Some of the people we have out there are able in Russian at the very least, and sometimes in Ukrainian language as well. Other times they're not, and we need an extra interpreter. We're lucky in that we have a very experienced team out there. Andrew Kramer is our lead reporter. We have opened a Kyiv bureau, and he is the Kyiv bureau chief, but he's been covering the Russia sphere for decades. He also was one of my reporters in both Afghanistan and Iraq. when we were covering that. And so he knows how to handle himself in a security environment. And he's a mentor to younger reporters who come into that environment. Thomas Gibbons Neff, TM, as we know him, who's writing some of the most lyrical scene kind of "you are at the front" kind of dispatches from the war zone, is a former Marine. He did 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan. He was the Kabul bureau chief when the Taliban took over. And he's been through some things. And it is from him that we are hearing that this is a whole different ball game as far as war journalism. It really is the most intense thing we've gone through. Carlotta Gall, a veteran of the Bosnia, the Yugoslavia war, also of Afghanistan. It's a good bunch we've got on our front line. But then we've got a whole expansive kind of second tier of people who are covering the political effects. Our entire Europe team is engaged. We work very closely with our Washington bureau. Obviously the United States has a stake in this war as well. So it really is a full contact sport right now. And that is a constant live briefing. Every day it's live coverage. And we have a team of editors dedicated to that too. And it starts in the Asia Day. It starts in Seoul, and they're going. And then it hands off to London, and then it hands off to New York, and then back to Seoul. So it really, it's quite a thing.
Well, and you talked about the security concerns there. How do you, as an editor, handle that tension between, and recognizing that you're kind of sitting safely at your desk, and the people you're dealing, working with are in not so comfortable situations.
Yeah.
The tension between, I really want the story, I really want get to that place and see what's going on, versus, all of this is very dangerous, and obviously wanting to take care of your people. How do you balance that?
You listen to them. And when they're saying no, you take no for an answer. Mm-hmm. I've lost friends doing this. I don't ever want to do that again. And a lot of us feel that way. And there are ways to lose friends too. I mean, there's the emotional trauma of covering this, of seeing people, civilians at risk in the middle of tremendous loss. There are kind of degrees of jeopardy here. The first order of business is keeping people alive. And so every day we talk about, what are we trying to cover? Okay, well, the front has moved. Now it's in Donetsk. Okay, so where is a safe zone to travel within Donetsk? Do we want to go all the way into Severodonetsk, or do we pull back? What does the road network look like? We have a saying, always have 2 ways out of everywhere you are. We as editors are just never going to push our correspondents to go to a place they don't think is safe. Or reasonably workable, maybe is a better way to put it, because there's not a lot of total safety anywhere. A lot of times we find that our correspondents push harder than our editors would. Oh, I can get there. Oh, I can do it. Yeah. And our job as editors is to say, yeah, are you sure? Draw up a plan. Let's look at the plan. Where are you going to stay? How are you going to get there? What happens if your car breaks down? What happens if somebody is hurt? Every place that our people go, they have to assess this. And then we as editors sit down with our security staff to look at it. This is part of the reason we will not take freelance from war zones. There are a whole bunch of reporters who feel like, hey, if I just get myself to this dangerous place and start reporting, the New York Times will hire me. No, we will never hire you that way. We don't want to put freelancers at risk. We don't want to put anybody at risk unless we have owned their safety. Okay, so if we do use freelancers, it has happened rarely, we send them. We make sure people are trained. We make sure they know our security regime, and then we will assign them a job, not at the very front, but maybe somewhere in the West. So that's just a general note for people who are thinking about freelancing in a war zone. Just increasingly, the Times won't do it. Mm-hmm. We don't want people taking chances because the risk is real out there. I don't know if that gets at it, but
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, it's something that I remember thinking about, when I was at the news
Mhm.
service there and would come down to chat with you guys on the international desk, that we were all co-workers, but most of us were co-workers inside the building of the New York Times. And then there was this whole cadre of people out there getting paychecks from the same company, often not being paid a lot more than we were, but they were literally putting their lives in danger every day going to work. And that's
yeah, we don't do that anymore. And we really kind of learned that through I think the Afghanistan and Iraq and the Syria conflicts in particular. Syria was this incredibly hazardous place where a lot of freelancers went. And we just realized we couldn't encourage anybody to do that. So it really is, it's a constant push every day to get intelligence about what's happening where, and where we can safely go, and have this vigorous discussion. And sometimes it's an argument about where we can go and how we could do it and what our aims are. But I mean, nothing is worth losing somebody. It's just not.
Had a couple of questions come in. Here's one sort of related to what we were just talking about. What about the Associated Press? Have they also cut back their sort of international reach, or are they still kind of out there on the ground where
Not that I have seen. I mean, you would need to ask somebody who works at the AP every day, but my perception is no, they have not cut back. And that's in part because the competition, as you said earlier, Jesse, the competition has dwindled. I think newspapers rely more on the Associated Press and Reuters and to some degree Agence France Presse, even more than they did before. So we don't perceive that they're cutting back. They are absolutely in the places we are for the most part. And Maria, I see also there's a question about how are the security teams selected? So they are employees. Basically, we have contracted with a security organization that is in every one of our staff meetings and have been for years. We started this process early in the Afghanistan war. So it's been the same core of security leadership for roughly 20 years, maybe just a little less than 20 years. They work with our correspondents every day. We know them all, they know us all. And they're all hired specifically because of their training. And some of them have also worked as journalists themselves. And so they understand some of the things that motivate us as journalists as we try to get places in the field. But for the most part, they're professionals.
Well, and we had a question from Professor Harmon asking about what do we lose when a broadcast network, so for example, ABC, NBC, whoever, covers a story in Poland from the London bureau, which is certainly something we see. You'll turn on the TV and the reporter will actually be in front of Big Ben, but they're talking about something that happened, somewhere else. I guess just, in general, how important is it to have people reporting on the ground versus somebody a couple of time zones away?
It's difficult to do it remotely, but increasingly we're seeing it happen more often. And there are reasons for that. A lot of people are taking a page from China's book and are deciding that why not just shut reporters out? Why not just keep them away? So we're in a horrible fix covering mainland China, which is one of the biggest stories in the world. We have exactly 2 correspondents on the ground in mainland China, and we are constantly at risk of losing their accreditation and work visas because the government plays hardball. Now, I can tell you that the coverage is a lot more rich when we have people on the ground and there. And this is something, part of my job is like reasoning with governments. They won't give us a visa. Okay, well, we're on the phone with them. Look, why not? The coverage is going to be more nuanced and perhaps even more empathetic. If I have a reporter on the ground in Pakistan for example, where we had a bureau there until 2013, and then we were ejected. And now when we come back, it's maybe a month at a time on an occasional visa, and it's always heavily contested. And the argument we make to governments is, look, if you want the world to understand you better and to understand what your personal issues are and how they work out, then you absolutely want New York Times journalists on the ground there. But it's a hard sell, in places like Venezuela, in Pakistan. I worry that it's going to happen increasingly in India and mainland China. Sometimes it's hard to have people there. Do we lose something? Yes. We lose richness. We lose voices that aren't supplied by the government or by security services. We lose some of the truth of everyday life. And to Mr. Harmon's question, to the class's question is, yeah, we do lose something when a news organization does not have, even if somebody's not there all the time, you need to have people there who are versed in it, who are sourced up, who are talking to officials all the time, who know what the local issues are. You always run the risk of like a hot take that's just wrong, an analysis that's wrong. And we traffic in analysis. Like at the end of the day, that's what the New York Times has. It's one thing to say that something happened and tell people that it happened. It's another thing to say, why is this important? Why should you pay attention? How did it get this way? That's the analytical part of it. And that's why you need people on the ground, which is why we hire a lot of people, even if it's just part-time, to help advise us when we go into other countries. But it's harder and harder to do.
Well, and so we do have some journalism students watching. If there are people who are interested in, international reporting, given the sort of relative paucity of actual jobs in that field, as we talked about, what should people start doing? What are there classes they should take, skills they should develop? Are there other ways to kind of build up that expertise short of working in, some newspaper's foreign bureau?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of different paths for a lot of people, but there are some things that tend to work better. If you're very specifically interested in international reporting, there's no substitute for language and for getting yourself to that place. This is where doing what it takes to get a job at the AP, to get a job at an English language outlet that is out in the field, we do tend to look at people more when they are in a place reporting and doing the work. It's just automatically going to put you a leg ahead. If you don't need an interpreter to do your job, even better. Now, often we'll take those people and eventually we'll move them to different places and they'll need to work with an interpreter. But I think to get noticed, a lot of people just hustle and get themselves out there, and then they do incredible work and we start, paying attention. Christina Goldbaum, who was a Livingston Award winner, most outstanding kind of correspondent 30 or younger a few years ago, for her work in Somalia. And she basically started as a freelancer. She was fascinated by it, got herself out there, really started doing it. We took notice, we ended up hiring her. And at first she worked on the Metro desk, covering New York City transit, which is kind of its own combat zone in a different way. But now she's out there doing it. She covers Afghanistan and Pakistan. She's going to go to Qatar to help cover the World Cup. And it all started with her getting herself out to a place and really learning it and doing unbeatable work. But that isn't the only path. The big thing, be a really good writer and be a really good reporter who gets stuff right and who understands the big picture. Sometimes it is like incredible local reporting, and we take notice of the quality of the writing and the quality of the thought. And it's like, hey, maybe this person is somebody we want to try out overseas. It's like, if you can write that big story that way, if you can write in a way that transports readers into other people's lives, into the problems and the issues that they're covering, And that's the bottom line of what we do, and so does it totally matter if you haven't done that overseas? Yeah, maybe not. Okay, just be really good at what you do. And then the basics, right? The fundamental things apply. Always network, always make sure that when you're doing good work, people see it, you know. Social media is both a blessing and a curse when it comes to that, but there's little substitute for it. But as far as paying their dues, sometimes it's not so much where, it's just that you start doing the work.
And basic journalism skills kind of translate across whatever setting you're in.
Always. I got to tell you, even though there is in recent years kind of a dearth of other news outlets that are doing a lot of international work, we are seeing young journalists come out of school very well trained. And it's honestly, it's testament to the quality and the dedication of a lot of, the university level kind of classwork. There are young journalists who can do stuff that I've had to learn the hard way in recent years, but they're coming out. They know how to work well on microphone and on camera. They understand the importance of visuals, not just for their own sake, which is vital, but also for as your own kind of notebook. Can you think visually? Can you write visually? So I think for young journalists, like a lot of what you're doing is really great. The problem is that we don't have as many ways to notice you, and to find you. So take advantage of your networking. I wish there were more internships that were better paid so that we could have a truly diverse candidate pool, and this is all stuff that we're starting to realize that the New York Times has to give back kind of to the community. One of the most interesting things we've done is Dean Baquet, who the legendary executive editor of the New York Times, just recently retired by not retiring. He's starting like basically a foundation for investigative journalism that he wants to push out to communities. And the idea is that you bring people in for fellowships and teach them the craft of investigative journalists with the intent of they're going back to their hometowns and their home cities, and they're going to do it there with top level training. But that's what we need, is just do vital work where you are, and then try to get us to see it. And we're trying to do a better job of hunting for it.
Shifting gears a little, you mentioned social media, and I wanted to ask you about, especially when you're covering, say, something like Ukraine, where the information environment is obviously chaotic and a lot of
it's hostile.
And hostile.
Hostile is what it is. But yeah.
So, Twitter is full of posts every day about Ukraine, from Ukraine, or purporting to be from
Ukraine. Yeah.
How do you all and your reporters assess all of that, figure out, what's valuable, what's clearly propaganda or disinformation, where it's coming from? I mean, how do you manage that?
It's terrifying and it's haphazard. The world has never seen a disinformation environment like the one we're in right now. Let's turn it back for a second to the question, what kind of classes is it important that people take? I think it is crucial, not just for journalists, but for citizens to have media literacy ideas. How do you vet a source? How do you know whether to trust a source of information? How do you compare? This is all becoming central to life, to modern life, because it is weaponized out there. The propaganda, I mean, on the Ukrainian side too, by the way, is thick. And sometimes it's, there's so much tampering of images or misrepresentation of the origin of information or images. Anything that we follow up from social media, we have to verify a separate way. We just won't take anything, even just quotes anymore. We're pretty hostile to the idea of just dumping it into the report, unless we can verify that the person is real in some way. And even then, sometimes we get burned. I think that, you know, the bottom line of journalism is speaking truth to power and holding power accountable. And some of the biggest purveyors of the disinformation that we're fighting right now are governments, our security services, local warlords, political operatives the world over. They all have it in for us. They're all trying to use us to get their fake information out. And I think when you, it is easier to distrust now than it was, and I think it's better that we distrust it, because you can take your paranoid fantasies to quite a level, and it's probably at least that bad in real life when it comes to the disinformation network. So we have information security teams at the New York Times as well that's monitoring a lot of what we do, and computer assisted reporting teams. But I think a lot of it is training yourself, taking the opportunities that you have to educate about, you know, how you try a source, how you try a report, how you run it out and verify it. It's all crucial to the work we do now.
Mhm. Well, and I guess you said something that I thought was interesting, that you know, everybody kind of tries to use the New York Times and tries to use the big media outlets to plant their stories. And obviously everybody can be their own publisher now, and they push their own stuff out on Twitter and on Facebook and wherever else. But I guess how important, because you know, there's one storyline out there that like the mainstream media doesn't matter anymore, that even the New York Times, you know, people can get their information directly from where, but in your experience, like how important is it to, say, a foreign security service to plant a story in the New York Times? What clout does it still carry for information to appear in the New York Times versus just showing up on somebody's Twitter feed?
I mean, the bet that we're taking as a journalistic outlet and as a business is that quality will out, you know, that the rigor, you know, people ask me all the time, what's the one thing you want the public to know, you know? And that is how hard we work to get it right. Like how many of us are involved in it. Like the argument, the pushing, the pulling that's happening just within the New York Times over every story every day. You know, Jesse, I know you saw some of that, right? You know, where we have this network, you know, and like the editors, like where you were working, who are helping us put Time stories kind of out there so that other publications can run them. You guys were a safety net too. You know, it's like you'd see something and you'd call back to the desk and, are you sure that's right? There's so many people working so hard to try to get it right. And it's very disheartening to see people in public say, oh, they just make it up. Well, then, okay, why are we paying money to so many people? You know, why are my friends getting shot at in Eastern Ukraine right now? No, we care about getting it right. So we are making a bet that people see that when they actually read our stories, rather than following the talking points, you know, of their favorite political party, that they actually see, oh, they're out there. And we're trying to do a better job, by the way, of explaining, like when we have people on the ground in these places reporting, doing direct first person reporting, we can't assume that the reader knows that or understands it. Like people don't know what a dateline is anymore. So we've really gone to pains to say, hey, these people are in Ukraine doing reporting. And sometimes we'll explicitly put it in the byline. Other times we'll make sure we write the story, you know, in a way that does that. So we're hoping that people will continue to see that we put a lot of credence in getting it right and getting the analysis right, that it's better than random Twitter bot, you know, posting a political talking point. But I think a good media diet now is not just one place. I personally, as a journalist, I don't expect or encourage anybody to just go to the Times. I mean, that's dumb. No, you want to be, information is important. News is important. And so you want to go to a lot of places. Yes, you want to find trusted sources on social media and see what they're saying about it. Yes, you want to get a sampling of different news organizations or different information sources. That goes back to media literacy in the modern age. You know, it's like, how do you curate your own information stream and evaluate it? I hope that the Times is a central part of that, and I work really hard to make sure that we're worthy of that. But you don't just trust one source anymore, and you shouldn't.
Well, probably getting toward wrapping up time here. So I thought maybe I would end by just, especially since we do have some students here. If people are thinking about journalism, you know, the landscape can look kind of grim. There's a lot fewer journalism jobs than there were 10 or 20 years ago. And if you do get one of those jobs, you're less likely to have the support of, you know, an experienced editing team and all of that.
Yeah.
So what would be your case to tell people, no, you should still go into journalism, and here's why?
Well, just reference everything we just said about disinformation. We're seeing now just how valuable a corner on the truth is, you know, and more than ever, we need dedicated people who are out there in their communities, out there in the world, out there in the country, doing everything they can to shine a light on it, you know, and try to get facts out there and to defend facts and science, and to have a complex view of the political landscape. You know, it's more than just two poles, people. It's a continuum. I mean, the need for it has never been greater, but it can be daunting, you know, and especially when you see so many, you know, kind of smaller outlets like asking you for your work for free, or the expectation that you'll take an internship for free, you know, and that's a hard reality. But we need people who are dedicated to bringing everything that's happening to light, you know. And if you feel that fire, okay, then you start working where you are. And again, you start networking as much as you can. Find a mentor, find somebody who's doing what you want to do, follow them, pick their brains. It's a trade, you know, to me. It's a, you know, more than a profession. I guess I'm making horseshoes is what I just compared myself to. But maybe there's some truth to that. You know, this idea of doing an apprenticeship and kind of becoming a, you know, a noted craftsman in your field. It really does come back to craft. And one of the best things you can do is find mentors, even if it's not whole news organizations. There's surely somebody in your community doing work that's important to it. So find out, do your first reporting job, find out who those people are, use them as sources. You know, that's part of the art of journalism, is talking to people and finding out what they know and what they feel. And, you know, there's no substitute for that. So get out there and do it to the furthering of your own career.
Good words. Yeah, you said trade and craft, and the other word that I use a lot is practice.
Yeah.
Practice. You get up every day and you do it, and you get a little bit better at it.
Yeah. Well, you hope anyway.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Doug. I really appreciate it. And I guess I'll toss it back to Maria if she wants to take us out.
Yes, I want to extend my thanks to Doug for coming here. That was an absolutely fascinating topic. I enjoyed every bit of it. We've got it streaming on Facebook. We'll put it up on YouTube. So appreciate everybody coming. Michael Martinez just said, thank you so much. Great information. Michael Martinez is a journalism professor and media historian at the University of Tennessee, and also one of our board members. And I agree with everything you said. Journalism matters. It matters right here in your own backyard. It matters around the world. And like the economy, it's global. I mean, what happens overseas affects what happens here. I mean, there's borders for countries, but there's no borders for news. It affects all of us. So
for sure.
Thank you, Doug, for taking time out. I know you probably missed about 20 emails and 4 calls or 5 calls during this exchange.
That
Thank
was
you,
the good
Jesse.
part.
So we know you have to get back to work. And I mean, New York Times, Washington Post, these are incredible newspapers. I read both of them, and I encourage everyone to find some coins in your budget and support excellent journalism. So
Thanks
thank
for your
you.
time, everybody. Thank you.
Appreciate you, and
Thanks
we
a lot.
will definitely be in touch.
All right. Thanks, y'all.